The evidence bags were gone, the photographer's flashes just memory, but the weight of what had been revealed pressed down on them both. The rumble of Walter Brennan's old Ford truck broke through their shocked silence. Grace looked up to see their neighbor pulling into the driveway, his vehicle kicking up dust in the late afternoon heat. Walter had been their neighbor for over 20 years, his property line running along theirs for nearly a mile. He'd been a good friend through all those years, the kind of neighbor who'd show up to help during harvest without being asked, who'd check on their animals when they took their rare vacations. Walter's face was already etched with genuine concern as he climbed out of his truck. At 62, he moved with the careful gait of a man who'd spent his life doing physical labor, his joints reminding him of every fence post driven and hay bale lifted. As he climbed the porch steps, Grace could see the worry deepening the lines around. His eyes, "Grace, Garrett," he said, removing his John Deere cap. "I saw all the police cars from my east field. Must have been a dozen of them. What in God's name happened?" Grace tried to speak, but found her throat closed with emotion. Tears she'd been holding back since the police left suddenly spilled over. Garrett moved to her side, his hand on her shoulder, and answered for them both. "They found her, Walter. They found Nora." Walter's weathered face went white with shock. "Found her? Where? How?" "In Cedar Creek," Grace managed to say between sobs. "A magnet fisher pulled up an old milk can this morning, our milk can. She was, ... She was inside." Walter's legs seemed to give out, and he sat heavily in the wicker chair across from them, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles went white. "Dear Lord," he whispered. "Oh, Grace, Garrett, ... I can't imagine what you're going through." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "When I lost Daniel in that grain silo, it nearly killed me. But at least, ... double quotes," he paused, swallowing hard. "At least I got to bury my son, got to say goodbye. You've spent 3 years not knowing what happened to your girls, and now this." Grace noticed how Walter's hands trembled slightly as he spoke about Daniel. His son had been 24 when the accident happened 5 years ago, a young man just starting to take over more responsibility on the farm. The grain silo had malfunctioned, and Daniel had suffocated before anyone could reach him. She remembered attending the funeral, how Walter had stood alone at the grave after everyone else had left, his shoulders shaking with grief. His wife had left him the year before Daniel died, unable to handle his drinking problem that had developed after a bad harvest, nearly bankrupted them. "The police," Walter said, pulling himself back to the present. "All those crime scene people, they don't think you." "They do," Garrett said bitterly. "The milk can came from our farm, so we're suspects. They're treating us like we killed our own daughter." Walter's face flushed with indignation. "That's insane. Anyone who knows you, how could they even think such a thing?" "They have to follow the evidence," Grace said hollowly, repeating the detective's words. "The evidence that says someone put our baby in our milk can and threw her in the creek like trash." The late afternoon sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful any other day. Walter looked at them both, then stood with decision. "You shouldn't be alone right now," he said firmly. "And I know you're in no state to think about the animals. I'll handle the evening feeding. I know where everything is. Walter, you don't have to," Garrett started, but Walter cut him off with a raised hand. "It's what neighbors do. Besides, I know exactly what needs doing." Those horses need their grain, the chickens need to be locked up for the night, and that old mare of yours, Buttercup, right? She needs that special feed for her teeth. Grace managed a weak smile. Despite everything, Walter did know their farm almost as well as they did. He'd helped them enough times over the years, and they'd returned the favor just as often. Your feed delivery is scheduled for tomorrow morning, isn't it? Walter continued. I can be here to receive it if you need to be dealing with ... with funeral arrangements or legal matters. The word funeral hit Grace like a physical blow. They would have to bury their daughter, plan a service, pick out a coffin small enough for the remains that had been crammed into a milk can. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. Walter moved around their property with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been there countless times. Grace watched from the porch as he headed to the barnot, the one wrapped in crime scene tape, but the newer one where they kept the feed. He knew exactly which barrel contained the chicken feed, which bags were for the horses. He even remembered that Buttercup needed the senior feed with added supplements for her aging teeth and joints. As he worked, moving between the chicken coop and the horse pasture, Grace found herself grateful for his presence. The routine of farm chores, even performed by someone else, provided a tiny bit of normalcy in a day that had shattered their world. Walter was just closing the chicken coop door, having made sure all the hens were safely inside for the night, when another vehicle turned into their driveway. This one moved faster than Walter's careful approach, gravel spraying as it braked hard near the house. The Channel 7 logo on the van's side made Grace's stomach drop. Reporter Kelly Martinez jumped out before the van had fully stopped, her cameraman right behind her, already hoisting his equipment onto his shoulder. Martinez was young, maybe late 20s, with perfectly styled dark hair that seemed impossibly maintained in the rural Iowa heat. Her eyes lit up when she saw Grace and Garrett on the porch. Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield, she called out, hurrying toward them with her microphone. Kelly Martinez, Channel 7 News. Could we have just a moment of your time about this morning's discovery? No, Grace said immediately, standing up. Please, leave. This is private property, and we're asking you to go. But Martinez was already at the bottom of the porch steps, her cameraman's lens trained on them. I understand this is difficult, but the public deserves to know. Garrett put his hand on Grace's shoulder, a gesture that could have been comforting or restraining. We can answer a few questions, he said quietly. Grace looked at him in surprise, but saw something in his eyes, maybe the need to have their side heard, to push back against the narrative that was already forming. Martinez's professional smile widened. Thank you. First, can you confirm that human remains found in Cedar Creek have been identified as your daughter, Nora? The identification isn't official yet, Garrett said carefully. But yes, we've been told the remains are likely our daughter's, and the milk can they were found in that came from your farm. Grace saw the trap immediately, but Garrett had already nodded. We had many of those cans years ago. We sold most of them. Martinez's expression shifted, becoming harder, more predatory. Do you care to comment on the accusations that you murdered your own daughter? The words hung in the air like poison. Grace felt her knees go weak again. What accusations? Garrett demanded. Who's making accusations? Sources close to the investigation say you're being treated as suspects, that police searched your property for evidence. Martinez pressed closer. Where are you hiding the second girl, Mr. Whitfield? Where is Cora? How dare you? Grace gasped. How dare you come here? And is it true you took out a large life insurance policy on both girls just months before they disappeared? Martinez continued relentlessly. That you were having financial troubles with the farm. Get off our property, Garrett said, his voice dangerously low. Now, Martinez held her ground for another moment, the cameras still rolling. The public will draw their own conclusions from your refusal to answer, she said coolly, then finally gestured for her cameraman to lower his equipment. As the news van pulled away, Grace noticed Walter's truck had stopped at the end of their driveway. He'd been watching the entire encounter. After a moment, his truck slowly continued down the road, leaving them alone with the devastating realization that instead of being able to grieve their daughter's death in peace, they would now have to defend themselves against accusations of murder. Chapter 3. A Neighbor's Kindness. By 7 p.m., darkness was falling across the Iowa farmland, the last traces of orange sunset fading into deep purple. Grace and Garrett had spent the past hour in silence, each lost in their own grief, when Walter's truck rumbled back up their driveway. His headlights swept across the porch, where they still sat, unable to move forward with any normal evening. Routine. Walter climbed out, his figure silhouetted against his truck's cab light. I've already taken care of your chickens and horses, he called out as he approached. Got everyone fed and watered, coop locked up tight. Thank you, Walter, Garrett said, his voice hoarse from the day's emotions. We should pay you for. Don't even think about it, Walter interrupted. Though, I did notice your grain supply is running pretty low. The delivery tomorrow will help, but you'll need something for the morning feeding. I've got plenty in my barn. Why don't you come get a few sacks to tide you over? Garrett started to rise. I'll go with you. No, Grace said suddenly, standing up. I'll go. When Garrett looked at her with concern, she added, I need to do something, anything. I can't just sit here anymore. Grace, you should rest, Garrett protested. Today has been, I know what today has been, she said sharply, then softened her tone. Please, I need to keep my hands busy or I'm going to fall apart completely. Garrett understood that need, the desperate desire to do something practical, something normal, when your world had been shattered. He nodded reluctantly. Grace climbed into Walter's truck, the familiar smell of feed dust and old leather somehow comforting. They drove the short distance to his property in silence, the truck's headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. Walter's barn loomed ahead, a massive structure that had stood for nearly a century, weathered but solid. Inside, a single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows across the packed dirt floor and equipment-lined walls. The barn smelled of hay and motor oil, the scent of a working farm. Walter led her to the feed storage area, pointing out several 50-pound sacks of grain. This should get you through a couple days, he said, hefting the first sack. Here, you get that end. Grace moved to help him, grateful for the physical task. They worked together to load the first sack into his truck bed, then returned for another. As Walter reached for the second bag, Grace's eyes wandered around the familiar space. That's when she saw a roll of blue work, tarp tucked behind an old cultivator. The distinctive yellow stripes were visible even in the dim light. The image from the detective's tablet crashed into her mind with violent clarity. The small form wrapped in that same blue tarp with yellow stripes. The way the plastic had degraded, after years in water, but still held its terrible secret. Her baby, her Nora, wrapped and discarded like ... The world tilted. Grace stumbled backward, her vision graying at the edges. She reached out blindly for support, but misjudged the distance, her head connecting hard with a low wooden beam. Pain exploded across her forehead, and she felt herself falling. Grace. Walter dropped the grain sack and rushed to her, catching her before she hit the ground. What happened? Are you all right? She touched her forehead and her fingers came away sticky with blood. A small cut, but head wounds always bled freely. The tarp, she managed to say, pointing with a shaking hand. It's the same ... in the photos. Wrapped around ... Understanding dawned on Walter's face. He looked stricken as he helped her to an overturned bucket to sit on. Oh God, Grace, I'm sorry, I didn't think. Here, let me get that out of sight. He quickly moved to the tarp, rolling it up tighter and shoving it behind other equipment, where it couldn't be seen. When he returned, he had an old but clean rag in his hand, which he pressed gently to her forehead. I'm so sorry you had to see that, he said, his voice full of genuine remorse. I used those tarps for everything around here, covering equipment, lining the truck bed. I never thought about how it might. After what you saw today, Grace held the rag to her head, the sharp pain somehow grounding her in the present moment. It's not your fault. They sell those tarps at every hardware store in the county. It's just seeing it brought it all back. Walter crouched beside her, his weathered face creased with concern. Maybe we should get you home. Garrett will worry if we're gone too long. Grace nodded, suddenly exhausted. They loaded one more bag of grain in silence, Walter doing most of the work while keeping a watchful eye on her. As they prepared to leave, he turned off the barn light, plunging them into darkness broken only by the truck's headlights. I'll get the rest of those tarps out of here tomorrow, Walter said quietly as he helped her into the truck. Won't have anything round that might remind you, back home. Garrett immediately noticed the blood on Grace's forehead as she walked through the kitchen door. His exhausted face shifted to alarm as he jumped up from the table where he'd been sitting with his head in his hands. What happened? He moved to examine the cut, gently tilting her face toward the light. I'm fine, Grace said, though she let him guide her to a chair. I hit my head on a beam in Walter's barn. It's just a small cut. Garrett retrieved the first aid kit from under the sink, the same one they'd used countless times for the girl's scraped knees and minor injuries. His hands were gentle as he cleaned the wound with antiseptic, though Grace winced at the sting. How did you hit your head? He asked, applying a small bandage. Grace hesitated, then explained about seeing the blue tarp with yellow stripes, how it had triggered the memory of the evidence photos. Garrett's jaw tightened as she spoke, his movements becoming more rigid. Those photos, he said quietly. I can't stop seeing them either. Our baby wrapped in plastic like... He couldn't finish. They sat in silence as he put away the first aid supplies, both lost in the horror of what had been done to their daughter. By 8 p.m. Garrett had moved to the couch, saying he just needed to rest his eyes for a moment. Within minutes, the emotional exhaustion of the day had pulled him into deep sleep. Grace watched his face relax, the lines of grief temporarily smoothed away. She covered him with the quilt her mother had made years ago, the one the girls used to fight over during movie nights. Grace returned to the kitchen table but couldn't bring herself to eat. The casserole their church friend had dropped off that afternoon sat untouched in the refrigerator. Her stomach churned at the thought of food. Instead, she sat with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, her thoughts spiraling into dark places. Someone had killed her baby girl. Someone had taken Nora, and she forced herself to confront the reality cut. her up to fit inside that milk can. The medical examiner had been clinical about it during their brief phone consultation, talking about dismemberment and preservation conditions. But all Grace could think about was her daughter's small body, how someone had done such unspeakable things to fit her into that metal container. The house felt oppressively quiet. By now, the girls would have been getting ready for bed. There should be the sound of water running upstairs as they brushed their teeth, arguments about whose turn it was to set the table for breakfast, the soft murmur of Garrett reading bedtime stories. Nora had loved the Little House books, always asking for just one more chapter. Cora preferred picture books about animals, making Garrett do all the voices. Now there was nothing but the tick of the kitchen clock and Garrett's soft snoring from the living room. Through the kitchen window, Grace caught sight of headlights. Moving along Walter's back access road, the dirt track that ran behind his barn and connected to the old county road. The lights stopped and went dark near his barn. Walter was probably doing his evening equipment maintenance, she realized. He'd always been a creature of habit, checking his machinery every night, making sure everything was ready for the next day's work. She thought about how Walter had maintained these routines even after losing Daniel. He'd told her once that the predictability of farm life had saved him after his son's death. The animals still needed feeding, the crops still needed tending, the equipment still needed maintaining. The rhythm of farm life didn't pause for grief. Grace glanced at Garrett. Again, he was sleeping so deeply, more exhausted than she'd ever seen him. Today had aged him years in just hours. She couldn't bear to wake him, but her mind wouldn't stop racing, circling around the funeral arrangements that would need to be made. They'd need Walter's flatbed trailer to transport chairs from the church for the service. Their own truck wasn't big enough, and Walter had always been generous about lending equipment. She could walk over and ask him now while she knew he was in the barn, rather than burden Garrett with one more task in the morning. The decision made, Grace quietly took her phone from the counter and slipped out the back door. The night was warm and humid, typical for July in Iowa. Crickets chirped in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked. The walk to Walter's property along their shared fence line was one she'd made countless times over the years. They'd worn a path through the grass from decades of neighboring borrowing tools, sharing equipment, helping with harvests. Tonight, she used her phone's flashlight to navigate, the bright LED beam cutting through the darkness. As she walked, Grace tried not to think about how Nora and Cora had loved to visit Uncle Walter, always excited to see his barn cats and the old plow horse he kept more as a pet than for work. They'd felt safe on his property, just as safe as at home. The barn loomed ahead, a thin line of light visible under the main door. Grace could hear the faint sound of metal on metal Walter, working on something, keeping his hands busy, just as she needed to keep hers busy. 10 minutes after leaving her house, she reached for the barn door handle. Grace pushed open the barn door, the hinges creaking softly in the night air. Inside, Walter was hunched over his workbench, a kerosene lantern casting dancing shadows across the walls. Tools were spread before him as he worked on what looked like a carburetor. The smell of machine oil and old hay filled the space. At the sound of the door, Walter looked up, startled. The wrench in his hand clattered to the concrete floor. His eyes were wide with shock, clearly not expecting anyone at this hour.